This is York. She's 2 years old, can reach a maximum BMI of 600, and has spent most of her time on this planet as a professional toilet. A very greedy toilet who betrayed us for her ambition of becoming a world noble, and in doing so, York orchestrated one of the most impactful incidences in One Piece world history. But the big question I have with York is, how does she stack up to all of the not hers? Well, we're going to find out, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the hungry hippo herself, York. So first up, let's clarify exactly what York is. York is one of 6 Vegapunk satellites, an eclectic mixture of clones and machines, which Dr. Vegapunk created in order to separate certain parts of his humanity to create a more efficient workflow. And within York, Vegapunk decided to store all of his concentrated greed. Probably not a great idea from the world's smartest man, but let's see how it works out for him. Oh well. As mentioned before, York is 2 years old, but she's biologically 16, which is interesting to consider, because generally we mortals have no control over our age. However, Vegapunk did. He popped out all of his satellites at the exact age he wanted them to be. So York is 16, Atlas is also 16, Edison is somehow 18, Lilith is 24, Pythagoras is 26, and Shaka is 30. So not only did Vegapunk create a being out of pure greed, but he also made that being a teenager, the most volatile of all of the human existences. However, York is introduced as the most underwhelming Vegapunk. Whilst everyone else is busy inventing and testing things to revolutionize existence as we know it, York's role was to serve some more basic mechanical needs. When Edison starts to feel hungry while working, he asks York to eat. When Pythagoras needs to go to the bathroom, he asks York to do it for him. She also sleeps for them, all of them. And this process has an official name known as the EPS cycle, eat, hoop, sleep. And it shouldn't be ignored that York's existence is probably a dream scenario for Eiichiro Oda himself. As a man who mostly wants to do nothing except sit and draw his story, the idea of having someone who could serve as a surrogate for his physical needs is nothing but a dream. But York is of course depicted as more dopey than the rest of the satellites, at least initially, and being blonde probably doesn't help that initial impression either. But all of this was constructed to intentionally deceive us, because I love a good old-fashioned mystery. And the mystery genre in general is one that One Piece doesn't dip into too often, and I feel like it really should, because it always results in some very compelling storytelling, like the mystery of who shot Iceberg on Water 7, leading to the reveal of CP9. And this mystery aspect is where York absolutely excels. Her existence is engineered to place suspicion onto the other Vegapunks. Shaka, Edison, and Pythagoras in particular commanded a lot of suspicion from me because of how emotionally transparent they weren't. Edison and Pythagoras are mechanical existences, and Shaka always had a mask on, so their motives were always in question, because it was much harder to emote and empathize with them due to those barriers. However, on the other hand, we have Lilith, Atlas, and York, who are the complete opposite. They are always completely emotionally transparent, especially Lilith, who wasn't afraid of showing her aspect of evil, but it created the dynamic of the enemy you know versus the enemy you don't. So even though the traitor was likely somewhere among the 3 negative aspects, I felt much more comfortable around them because their cards were always face up on the table, or so I thought. Up until York was revealed, I was personally convinced that the traitor was Edison. He's the aspect of thinking, and without any emotions to be bound to, I suspected that the logical conclusion he came to, in order to best facilitate the path of science, was to betray the Vegapunks. And look, in my defense, Shaka, Pythagoras, and Stella did not suspect York either. They 100% put all of the suspicion onto Lilith, although I did always say when I was doing these chapters weekly that the most surprising option would be York. And that's what Oda went with. It was a big bombshell. However, this sort of deception is always a huge gamble. The most left field option is always going to be the most surprising, but also the most difficult to logically justify. If you have a character who you have deliberately gone out of your way to make the least suspicious, then it takes that much extra work to make that reveal satisfying. Because mysteries are not easy to write. They are so difficult, and you need to perfectly balance out the culprit. If you've got them too much in the foreground, then the reveal feels too obvious, like, oh, it was the guy we've been spending all of our time with and who was really suspicious. Oh, Kel, surprise. But then again, on the other hand, if you have the culprit too obscured in the background, if you're hiding them too much, then it feels like, oh, that came out of nowhere and the writer failed to foreshadow it, as if the writer backed themselves into a corner and couldn't come up with a satisfying answer. And the more mysteries you consume, the harder it is to be fooled by subsequent mysteries. So it's one of the most difficult genres to write. However, I think that Oda nailed it with York. Right before York announced that she was the traitor, we see 3 things that make her reveal one of the hardest hitting moments of Egghead Island. The First is York shooting Shaka in the head. This headshot is brutal and visceral, especially by One Piece standards. The impact of the shot sending Shaka's head flying back and contorting the rest of his body to follow, the abundance of blood splattering and all of the everything. It was quite a moment, and it did a lot to build up the ominosity of this traitor. But the second is that we also see S-Snake stepping on Pythagoras' head, killing him as well. And S-Snake was obviously ordered to do that by the traitor, so by the time we know the traitor is York, we are carrying the weight of 2 dead Vegapunks with us. And finally, right before York comes out of the darkness, the One Piece narrator, the mysterious narrator, has a monologue. One of, if not the longest monologue that the narrator has had in the entire series to date. It lasts for about 3.5 pages, and it's an abridged telling of the events of how Egghead Island got to this point, but also informing us of what was about to happen in the future. The resolution of this incident the following day would inflict a kind of shock that the world never saw coming. And it's after that line that York emerges, which is extremely powerful because York, she is riding right on that hype created by the narrator. And it gives the impression that York is going to be a dark central figure in these shocking events, which she wouldn't really be, but we'll get to that. Because right now, on the back of those feelings, York's 2-page traitor reveal is so damn good. And it's drawn with the kind of intimidating art that's very unique to One Piece, because here Oda uses York's scale to perfection, as the shot of her squatting down to Stella is incredibly frightening. Because when York was on our side, a giant woman, that's just kind of fun. Like that time that Zoro got caught staring at her butt, which inspired an artist to draw York from Zoro's perspective at the time. Great use of scale for fun, wacky comedy. However, when York is against us, her size is overwhelming, especially because her casual pistol is the size of a tank cannon, but this is also a great physical representation of the weight of intelligence. In the grand scheme of things, York is not a physical threat. She even admitted that herself. But at the same time, she is one of the 7 smartest people on the planet. And given how badly everything has gone on Egghead to this point, with the loss of 2 Vegapunks, York is a physical incarnation of being crushed by superior intelligence and planning, something that a lot of arc antagonists in One Piece quite severely lack. And also remember that at the time, this was portrayed as if York had outsmarted all of the other Vegapunks, that she had successfully pulled this off right in front of them. Now obviously there's more to add to that, but contextually this is one of the most powerful and memorable moments of Egghead Island. And after the full story is revealed, maybe not so much, but that doesn't take anything away from the moment itself. And there's also a panel on the far left of the final page of York's reveal where the illusion of perspective makes it look like York is taking a dump on Shaka's corpse, which I do admittedly find quite funny. But what I find a lot less funny is York's ambition, which is legitimately chilling and I think is the most well-written aspect of York. All of her actions made a disgusting amount of sense as soon as York stated that she wanted to become a world noble, because York's obsession with greed is essentially a feat of science, perhaps one that never should have been attempted, but her concentrated greed is an unnatural existence. However, the world nobles are a natural evolution of that greed. This group of people exist to do nothing except consume. They have no ambition beyond consumption. They're the result of generation after generation of entitlement, to the point where greed has become their sole culture. In many ways, the world nobles are actually a lot worse than York, because at the very least it's possible for York to be temporarily satisfied and briefly achieve a state of happiness. And we apparently have a metric for this as well, as York is capable of consuming food to the extent of having a body mass index of 600, where a normal BMI is anywhere from 18.5 to 24.9. So there is a pretty hard limit to her consumptive capabilities. It takes a long time to get there, but once that limit is hit, York enters a zone of bliss where she can briefly forget about her desire altogether. But the one thing you'll notice about the world nobles is that they are never happy. Even when they get exactly what they want, exactly when they want it, they are still miserable, because the entire universe itself would not be enough to satisfy the greed of even a single world noble. And if you want to think of it this way, the great tragedy of York is that she thinks that becoming a world noble, one of them, is going to satisfy her, but it won't. Once she gets there, all she's going to realize is exactly how much she doesn't have, and she'll then be tortured by greed for however long she happens to exist. And one of the more fascinating ideas that Oda poses to us is the danger of greed over violence and evil, because Atlas and Lilith were also satellites created to store Vegapunk's negative traits, and yet both of them were loyal to a fault, and greed was the only aspect to fall. One way of thinking about it is that evil, at the very least, has some understanding of the concept of morality, at least enough to know that it stands on the opposite end of the spectrum. But greed has no concern with intangible concepts like that, and it's an interesting message. message that we should be less afraid of the idea of evil and more concerned with the basic human faults that can lead someone down the path to eventually being described as evil, which is a lesson that the Vegapunks do learn over the course of Egghead thanks to York. As mentioned before, Shaka, Stella, and Pythagoras all initially labeled Lilith as the traitor with no investigation simply due to her having the label of evil, which is Oda saying be careful of judging people by labels given to them by others, which is something that we frequently encounter in regards to Luffy. In the eyes of everyone who's never met him, he is a sinister, chaotic, and very evil pirate. And the idea that Greed is the one that betrays all of the others is so perfect. Because of course Greed doesn't want to share its existence with 6 other people. And it does bring up a lot of uncomfortable questions because York isn't some uniquely horrible person. She is the manifestation of the latent greed within Dr. Vegapunk himself. She is a core portion of the best and brightest that humanity has to offer, which shows that even our best can be corrupted if they embrace greed too heavily. Any one of us has the potential to produce a York. And I think because of that, she hits very conceptually hard as an antagonist, but the reveal and the motivation are where I unfortunately think that York peaked, because she has a very unconventional antagonistic arc. As after her reveal, we receive a mid-arc time skip, which is extremely odd and very rare in and of itself, but after we return from this time skip, York has already been defeated, and she spends the remainder of the arc in a state of stagnation. I love the ideas that York poses, they're very fun to think about, but also this is a shonen manga, and the antagonist is always going to lose points if they don't do a lot of, antagonistic things that we get to see. For most of the time we spend with York, she's meant to be disarmingly pleasant, and the second that York is revealed to be the villain, we skip to a point in time where she's been defeated and miss out on the main meat of what a shonen villain is meant to provide. Because One Piece is a battle manga, which means that it tells its story, it evolves its characters through battles, and York didn't get any battles to evolve. Again, York admits that she isn't strong enough to defeat anyone in chapter 1079, which is fantastic self-awareness, and not a lot of villains have that, but it's not an amazing admission to help build her commanding presence. But what we also need to contextually understand is that York was in a no-win situation the moment that she was created by Oda. And that's because the big problem with York is that she does not provide an escalation. You can't go from beating 2 Emperors of the Sea on Wano to creating a genuinely compelling story with York as the main antagonist. The Straw Hats have simply beaten too many people well above her caliber at this point. And I would say that probably Doflamingo was the cutoff point for someone like York to really work as an arc antagonist. After Doflamingo, you can't go back down, only up. And that's why I think that Oda was actually extremely wise to have the night on Egghead Island play out off screen, because there is nothing that he could have drawn that would really be worth our time in a post-Wano series. So it was much better to just cut straight to the action involving Kizaru and the 5 Elders in order to get that escalation. Phenomenal story move, not a great move for York herself, because there are points during that second half of Egghead Island where I forgot that she was even there, and she was incapacitated for most of it as well. But also the structure of Egghead Island itself was very, very unfair to York, because as the arc was unfolding, we were consistently cutting to events all over the world, like Shanks versus Kid, Blackbeard versus Law, Garp on Hachinosu, Sabo's Reverie flashback, Kuma's flashback, and all of these events that were overshadowing what was actually happening right here on Egghead. Again, a fantastic story move, because this was easily the most exciting arc I have ever read on a weekly basis, but that does come with its victims. In fact, the very next thing that happened after York was revealed as the traitor was Eustace Kid versus Shanks on Elbaf. So she really got no time at all to bask in her role before Shanks took everyone's attention away from her. And this leads us to the biggest problem that I have with York in this role, which isn't her fault, but it's what I like to call Caesar syndrome. I had a very unfavorable view of Caesar Clown as the main antagonist because he kept getting one-upped by other villains in his own arc. Virgo performs the role better, the promise of Doflamingo incoming made me care a lot less about Caesar, and the idea of Luffy and Law forming an alliance to bring down Kaido made Caesar seem woefully insignificant, like he was just an annoying roadblock. And York is a very similar concept times about 1 billion, because York's role gets usurped by Kizaru, then that role gets usurped by Saint Saturn, which then gets usurped by all of the 5 elder old men, and it gets to the point where, again, I just kind of forgot that York was even there. What we have on Egghead Island is a staircase of antagonists, and York is an odd one because she is made to be a step to reach the higher tiers. But not only that, York isn't even really the first step, that would probably be Rob Lucci. So of this 5-step stair thing, York fits somewhere in the lower middle. York is step 2, and who even cares about step 2? Step 1, at least you remember that because it's the first one that happened, but 2? No one, no. And if we look at the current makeup of the villain tier list, what really does not help York at all is that Rob Lucci, Kizaru, and Saint Saturn have all been rated as S-tier villains, and they're all part of the arc where York is directly compared to each and every one of them. But I also think that Eiichiro Oda has made our job here quite simple, because the mystery leading up to York was fantastic. The ideas behind her were brilliant, but for the part where she actually had to serve as a villain, the part that was almost completely skipped, we just don't have anything to rank. I will say that I think she did better than Caesar because at least York has her iconic traitor moment, and there's nothing detrimental about her. It's just that Oda didn't even give her the opportunity to prove herself, so I think a D tier is pretty fair. But you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next.